When you're really digging into a philosophical problem and you just want to get to the core of it, like you don't want to get bogged down in all the details. You just want the heart of the matter. Well, that's kind of what we do here.
Right, to the essence.
Exactly. And today we're taking that approach with a really fascinating group, the Ikhwân al-Safâ.
The Brethren of Purity.
Yeah, and they left behind this really interesting work, kind of like a medieval encyclopedia, but way before the ones you usually think of.
It's called the Rasail Ikhwân al-Safâ wa Qulan al-Wafa, the Epistles of the Pure Brethren and the Sincere Friends.
Epistles. So we're talking letters.
Well, more like treatises. They cover a huge range of topics. Think of it as a whole educational program laid out in these epistles meant for a select group of intellectuals.
So a sort of secret society of knowledge seekers.
Maybe not secret, but certainly elite. And what's really interesting is that we don't know for sure who they were.
Oh, that's so frustrating. A whole encyclopedia and we don't know who wrote it.
It's a bit of a mystery. But that makes it even more intriguing, right? We have this vast system of knowledge touching on everything from math and science to philosophy and spirituality, and the authors are these shadowy figures.
I can see why philosophers would be drawn to this. Okay, so what's our plan for today?
Well, we're going to tackle some of the big questions surrounding the Ikhwân al-Safâ. Who were they? When did they write this? What were their philosophical and religious beliefs? And how did they use the ideas of the ancient Greeks? We're going to uncover some pretty fascinating insights along the way.
Sounds like a real philosophical puzzle. Let's get started. So who do we think these mysterious figures might have been?
The traditional view, which comes from writers like Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi and Abd al-Jabbar al-Hamadani, is that it was a group of scholars in Basra.
Basra. That was a major center of learning back then, right?
Absolutely, a real hub of intellectual activity. And the main figure in this group was Abu Asasan Ali B. Harun al-Zanjani, who was a qadi, a judge. And he had these associates like Abu Suleiman Muhammad B. Mashar al-Busti, also known as al-Makisi, Abu Ahmad al-Narajuri, and al-Afi. And they were all connected to this guy, Zaid B. Rifa, who worked as a secretary.
Okay, so pretty well-educated bunch. But you said this is the traditional view. What are the other possibilities?
Well, there's this guy, Maslama al-Qurtubi al-Majuti, who seems to have been the one who brought the epistles to Al-Andalus.
Al-Andalus, that's Muslim Spain, right?
That's right. And he did this pretty early on, like in the first half of the 10th century.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because if the epistles were already in Spain by then, it makes you wonder if the traditional timeline with the Basra group works.
Makes sense. It either means the epistles were written earlier than we thought, or there's more to the story of how they spread.
Exactly. And some scholars think that Maslama B. Qasim al-Qurtubi, who died in 964, might have actually been the author, or at least the main compiler.
Hold on. Is that the same Maslama who brought the epistles to Spain?
No, it's important to distinguish him from Maslama al-Majriya, the scientist who died later in 1007. This Maslama B. Qasim al-Qurtubi lived earlier.
Okay, I see. So if this guy was the author, it would mean the epistles were written earlier in the 10th century and possibly in Al-Andalus.
And there's even another theory. Guillaume de Vol-Darcy has suggested that Ahmad B. al-Tayyib al-Saraksi, a student of the famous philosopher al-Kindi, might be the author, and this would push the date back even further to around 894.
Wow, so we have three completely different possibilities.
And the debate is still going on. It just shows you how difficult it can be to figure out who wrote something from so long ago, especially when they didn't want to be known.
True. It's like a historical detective story, and we might never know for sure who done it. Speaking of mysteries, what about their name, Ikhwân al-Safâ? What does that mean, and does it give us any clues about who they were?
Well, it means brethren of purity, and there are a few different ideas about what it signifies.
Purity. That sounds interesting.
Right. One scholar, Goldsire, thought it might be connected to Kalila wa Dimna, a collection of animal fables where there are groups of loyal friends.
So like a brotherhood of intellectuals.
Yeah, something like that. But S.M. Stern thought it could be a reference to the Ismailiyya, a branch of Shia Islam that emphasizes purity and secret knowledge.
Ooh, secret society again.
But the most common view is that purity refers to purifying the soul through knowledge and ethical living. Wilhelm Diewald was a big proponent of that interpretation.
That makes sense. It fits with the idea of an encyclopedia as a way to gain knowledge and improve yourself.
Exactly. And recently, Farhad Daftari suggested that Ikhwân al-Safâ might just be a pseudonym, a way for the authors to hide their true identities.
So they might have had a reason to stay anonymous. Maybe political or religious reasons.
Possibly. It adds another layer of intrigue to the whole thing.
It does. Okay, so we've got a mystery about who they were and what their name means. What about the dating? When do we think they wrote this encyclopedia?
Well, as you can imagine, there's no easy answer. Heinrich de Ricci, back in the 19th century, thought it was written between 961 and 986. He based that on references he thought he saw to the poet al-Mutanabi.
So a late 10th century dating. Does that fit with what we know about the authors?
It would fit with the Basra group, but not so much with the other possibilities. Then Louis Massignon came along and pointed to a verse by Ibn al-Rumi that suggested the earliest it could have been written was 896.
Okay, so we're pushing it back a bit.
And he also looked at how they defined the sign, a mathematical concept, and compared it to the work of the astronomer al-Battani, which led him to think it couldn't have been written much later than that. He also connected the expected event they talk about in the epistles to the Fatimid conquest of Egypt, which happened around that time.
So we've got some historical and scientific clues to work with.
Right. But then Jean Casanova, who really dug into the astronomical data in the epistles, argued for a much later date, somewhere between 1047 and 1051.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It is. But most scholars don't agree with that later date.
Okay, so back to the late 9th or 10th century.
More recently, Yves Marquet went back to de Ricci's idea of 961 to 980, noting that it fits with what Al-Tabari said. But he also said it could have been earlier, maybe around 909, especially if the authors were connected to the Ismailis. He linked this to the proclamation of the Fatimid Caliph Abulal al-Mahdi.
So the Fatimids keep popping up.
They do. And Abba Samdani, after looking at all the arguments, concluded that it was probably written between 873 and 909. He also thought there might be a link to the early Fatimid movement.
So a lot of scholars seem to be pointing towards the late 9th or early 10th century.
But then there's Gerald de Calatai. He focused on the astronomical cycles they describe in Epistle 36, and his analysis suggests a much wider range of dates, from the 9th century all the way to the 16th.
That's a really wide range.
It is. He connects specific conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter to possible dates of composition, and even to prophecies about a messianic figure called the Quem. He also links some of these cycles to the Fatimid conquest.
So maybe they were trying to connect their work to a larger historical or even prophetic timeline.
It's possible, but the main point is we don't have a definitive answer about when it was written, which makes it even more challenging to understand their philosophy and their intentions.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
Exactly, but that's part of the fun, isn't it?
It is. Okay, so we've talked about who they might have been and when they might have written this. Now the big question, what were their philosophical and religious ideas?
The heart of the matter. Well, because they talk so much about salvation and purifying the soul, many scholars think they were connected to Shiite Islam and maybe even the Ismaili branch.
The Ismailis. We've heard that name a few times already.
They were a pretty significant movement at the time. Some scholars, like Yves Marquet, think the epistles might be the earliest complete presentation of Ismaili thought.
Wow, that would make the Ikhwân al-Safâ pretty important figures in Islamic history. What evidence do we have for this Shiite connection?
Well, they clearly have a lot of respect for Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph. They see him as the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad and his wali, his spiritual guide.
So they follow the Shiite line of succession.
Yes, but it's not so simple. Some scholars point out that they sometimes talk negatively about the hidden imam, which is a central belief in Twelver Shi'ism.
So maybe not Twelver Shi'ism, but possibly Ismaili.
Some scholars think so. They point to a few things, like how the Ikhwân describe a hierarchical universe, how they talk about cycles in history that come in sets of 7, and how they distinguish between an intellectual elite and the masses.
I see. And what about specific symbols?
They use some symbols that are often associated with Ismailism, like the bee, which is sometimes seen as an allegory for the imam, the spiritual leader. Henry Corbin, a scholar of Islamic mysticism, was convinced they were Ismailis and interpreted their whole work in that light.
There's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction.
But not everyone agrees. Some scholars, like S.M. Stern and Wilhelm Diewald, think it was the other way around. They think the epistles actually influenced the development of Ismaili thought later on.
So they see the Ikhwân as precursors to the Ismailis, not actual members.
Right. And then there's the fact that the epistles themselves criticize supporters of the seven, which is an important idea in Ismailism. And they also talk a lot about celibacy, which is more of a Sufi thing.
So they seem to be borrowing from different traditions.
They do. And it's interesting because in the year 1150, the Sunni Caliph, al-Mustanjid, condemned the Rasail as heretical.
Wow. So they were seen as a threat by the Sunni establishment.
It seems so. But even though they were condemned, the Encyclopedia was still copied and translated into other languages.
So clearly they had a following, even if they were considered heretical by some.
Exactly. And it's not just Shiite and Ismaili ideas. Some scholars see influences from the Mu'tazilites, who were a group of rationalist theologians.
Rationalist theologians.
Yeah, they believed in using reason to understand religious doctrines. And some of the Ikhwân's ideas about free will and God sound similar to Mu'tazilite ideas.
So they were open to using reason to explore faith.
Yes, and they even saw science as a way to understand divine revelation better, which was different from some other theologians who were more suspicious of philosophy.
So they were really trying to bring together different ways of thinking, a real synthesis of philosophy and religion.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the classical heritage. They were heavily influenced by Greek philosophy.
Oh yeah, the Greeks. Everyone was reading them back then.
It was the foundation of a lot of intellectual life in the medieval period, and the Ikhwân were no exception. They were reading everything from the pre-Socratics to Plato and Aristotle, and even later thinkers like Plotinus and the Stoics.
So they were pretty well versed in Greek thought.
They were. In fact, the epistles are a really valuable source for understanding how much Arab scholars knew about Greek philosophy.
And did they just copy the Greeks, or did they do something new with their ideas?
That's a great question. They definitely made the ideas their own. Like when they quote or paraphrase the Greeks, it often lines up really closely with the Arabic translations that were being done at the time.
So they were using the same sources.
Yeah. And in some cases, they actually preserve the only Arabic versions we have of certain Greek texts.
Really? Like what?
A good example is the story of the Ring of Gyges from Plato's Republic, which is in Epistle 52.
Wow. So they weren't just readers. They were transmitters of Greek thought.
Precisely. And it's interesting to see how they engaged with different schools of Greek philosophy.
So they weren't just into one particular philosopher.
No, they were pretty eclectic. They don't quote Plato that much, mainly in the fourth section of the Encyclopedia, and even then, it's often with a religious spin.
So they were adapting Plato to fit their own worldview.
Exactly. And some scholars think this reflects how people learned about Greek philosophy back then. They'd start with Stoic ethics, then move on to Aristotelian logic and natural philosophy, and then finally get to Plato's metaphysics and theology.
That's like a curriculum.
It is. And it's interesting because the Ikhwân define philosophy as the imitation of God according to human capacity.
That's a very Platonic idea.
It is. So for them, philosophy wasn't just an intellectual pursuit. It was a way to become more like God.
To achieve a kind of spiritual perfection.
Exactly. And they were also heavily influenced by Aristotle, especially when it comes to how they understand the natural world and how they classify different types of knowledge.
So they borrowed from both Plato and Aristotle.
They did, but they weren't afraid to mix and match, which sometimes led to inconsistencies, especially when they tried to combine Aristotelian cosmology with Islamic ideas about God.
The challenges of trying to fit everything together.
Exactly. And then there's the quadrivium, the four mathematical sciences: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. They devoted a huge chunk of the encyclopedia to these.
The Greeks loved their math.
They did. And they saw these sciences as a way to understand the order and harmony of the cosmos.
So the Ikhwân were following in that tradition.
They were. And they relied heavily on thinkers like Euclid, Nicomachus, Ptolemy, and the Pythagoreans.
Those are some big names in math and astronomy.
They are. And the Ikhwân also dedicated a lot of space to logic, which they, like Aristotle, saw as the tool for all scientific inquiry.
The foundation of knowledge.
Exactly. And they actually placed logic above grammar and rhetoric, which was unusual at the time.
So they were emphasizing reason and argumentation.
They were. They saw logic as a way to distinguish truth from falsehood.
A kind of filter for knowledge.
That's a good way to put it. And they even have this table of sciences in Epistle 7 where they lay out a hierarchy of knowledge.
So they were trying to organize all knowledge into a system.
They were. They divided the sciences into propaedeutical sciences, religious sciences, and philosophical sciences.
And which one was at the top?
Philosophical sciences, of course. They saw that as the highest form of knowledge.
So they were true philosophers at heart.
Absolutely. But what's interesting is that the actual content of the encyclopedia doesn't perfectly match this table of sciences.
Oh, so their plan didn't quite work out.
Well, it makes you wonder if they were writing it over a long period of time and maybe their ideas changed, or maybe there were different authors who had slightly different views.
So the encyclopedia itself is a bit of a puzzle.
It is. And they also used Aristotle's distinction between theoretical and practical sciences.
Makes sense. Theory and practice.
But they linked even the theoretical sciences to the Ismaili idea of ta'lim, which is like religious guidance.
So even their pursuit of knowledge had a spiritual dimension.
Yes. And Epistle 20, which is about nature, is a good example of how they combined Greek ideas with their own religious beliefs. They mix in angelology and a Neoplatonic view of nature.
Neoplatonism, that's a whole other can of worms.
It is, but it shows that they were drawing from multiple sources.
Okay, what about other influences?
Well, they were big fans of the Pythagoreans.
The Pythagoreans, weren't they obsessed with numbers?
They were. And the Ikhwân called themselves true Muslim Pythagoreans.
Wow, so they really embraced that tradition.
They did. They believed that numbers held the key to understanding the universe. They saw connections between numbers and metaphysical principles, like God was the monad, the one, the active intellect was the dyad, the two, the universal soul was the triad, the three, and so on.
So everything was connected through numbers.
That's right. And they also believed in the Macranthropos, the idea that the universe is like a giant human being.
So we're all part of this cosmic body.
In a way, yes. And we also see some hints of Hermetic ideas in their work.
Hermeticism.
Yeah, it was a mystical tradition that emphasized secret knowledge and the interconnectedness of everything.
So they really were drawing from a wide range of sources.
They were, and they weren't just copying these ideas. They were transforming them, making them their own.
They were real intellectual synthesizers.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so fascinating. They show us how complex and creative intellectual life was in the medieval period.
It wasn't just a simple division between Islam and Greek philosophy.
No, it was much more fluid and dynamic than that.
It's like a tapestry woven from many different threads.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
Well, it's been a real pleasure exploring the world of the Ikhwân al-Safâ.
Likewise.
We've learned about the mysteries of their authorship, the debates about when they wrote their work, and the fascinating blend of philosophical and religious ideas that shaped their thinking.
And we've seen how deeply they were influenced by Greek thought.
It's been a real journey, and I think it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It does.
So to our listeners, I want to leave you with a question. What do you find most intriguing, or maybe even most puzzling, about the Ikhwân al-Safâ, about their attempt to bring together ancient wisdom and Islamic thought? And how do their ideas about the purification of the soul and the pursuit of knowledge resonate with you today?
It's a question worth thinking about.
It is. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.
And keep exploring.